Most people think anxiety is something that happens during the day when facing a difficult conversation, dealing with work stress, or confronting a real problem. But there's a specific kind of terror that shows up exclusively at night, when the world goes quiet and you're lying in darkness, and suddenly your heart starts racing for absolutely no reason you can name. If you've ever experienced this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That 3 a.m. panic where you're wide awake, chest tight, mind spinning, feeling like something's horribly wrong even though objectively everything's fine. Here's what almost nobody tells you. This isn't random. It's not just anxiety. And most importantly, you're not broken or weak for experiencing it. What's happening in your brain during those terrifying nights is actually a predictable psychological phenomenon with specific mechanisms. And once you understand how it works, you can finally start breaking the cycle instead of being trapped in it night after night, wondering why sleep has become your enemy. The psychology behind sudden anxiety at night challenges everything most people believe about fear and safety. We're taught that fear is a response to danger. See a threat, feel afraid, react accordingly. But nighttime anxiety exposes a strange and unusual psychological truth. The human brain can create overwhelming terror in the complete absence of actual danger. You're in your own bedroom, doors locked, so you're objectively safe, nothing threatening nearby, yet your body's responding like a predator is stalking you. Why? Because the mechanisms driving nighttime anxiety aren't about what's happening around you, they're about what's happening inside you. The weird psychology of this phenomenon reveals that the brain without distractions becomes hypervigilant. The body remembers traumas the mind suppressed, and consciousness itself becomes unstable at the threshold between waking and dreaming. These aren't three separate problems, they're interconnected systems all firing at once, creating that perfect storm of nighttime panic that leaves people exhausted, confused, and increasingly afraid of their own beds. Here's the counterintuitive truth that changes everything. Nighttime anxiety isn't the problem, it's a symptom. It's your nervous system trying to communicate something critically important that you've been ignoring during your busy, distracted days. Most people treat nighttime anxiety like an enemy to defeat, taking pills to shut it down, using sleep aids to force unconsciousness, employing meditation apps to override the panic. But what if the anxiety is actually trying to help? What if it's the body's desperate last attempt to get your attention about unprocessed stress, unresolved trauma, or fundamental misalignments between how you're living and what your nervous system actually needs to feel safe? This isn't some new age philosophy. It's based on decades of psychology and human behavior research showing that symptoms we try to suppress often intensify until we finally listen to what they're communicating. The people who break free from chronic nighttime anxiety aren't the ones who fight it hardest. They're the ones who finally understand what their body's been trying to tell them all along. So here's your reward for sticking with this. By the time you finish understanding the 4 mechanisms driving nighttime anxiety, the brain without distractions, hypervigilance in darkness, somatic memory, and sleep threshold dissociation, you'll possess knowledge that most mental health professionals don't even fully grasp. You'll understand exactly why your nights became battlegrounds, what your body's actually responding to, and most importantly, what you can actually do about it. Not surface-level tips like avoid caffeine or try breathing exercises, real fundamental understanding of how to work with your nervous system instead of against it. This isn't about fixing yourself because you're not broken. It's about finally decoding the language your body's been speaking in the darkness, night after terrifying night, waiting for you to understand what it's desperately trying to say. The brain without distractions, when silence amplifies fear. There's something profoundly unsettling about lying in bed at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, feeling your heart race for no apparent reason. During the day, the mind stays busy, emails ping, conversations flow, traffic honks, music plays. But when night falls and silence wraps around like a heavy blanket, something strange happens inside the human brain. The distractions vanish, the noise stops, and suddenly, every worry you've been shoving aside all day comes flooding back with terrifying clarity. This isn't just restlessness or ordinary stress. It's a psychological phenomenon where the absence of external stimuli forces the mind to turn inward, and what it finds there isn't always pleasant. The brain, stripped of its usual defenses, becomes hyper-aware of itself. Every heartbeat feels louder, every thought feels heavier, every fear feels more real. Scientists call this the cognitive unmasking effect, but most people just call it hell. What's fascinating and deeply weird is that this reaction isn't actually about nighttime itself. It's about what happens when the brain loses its ability to distract itself from uncomfortable truths it's been avoiding. Most folks don't realize that the human brain is essentially a pattern-seeking machine that's constantly scanning for threats. Throughout human history, silence meant danger. Predators hunt quietly, ambushes happen in stillness, threats emerge from the shadows. Our ancestors who stayed alert during quiet moments survived, those who didn't became someone else's dinner. So when modern humans lie in darkness with nothing but their thoughts, that ancient survival mechanism kicks in hard. The brain starts manufacturing problems to solve, creating worst-case scenarios to prepare for, generating anxieties about situations that haven't even happened yet. It's not malfunctioning, it's doing exactly what evolution programmed it to do. The weird psychology here is that the mind can't differentiate between actual danger and perceived danger. A forgotten bill, an awkward conversation from 3 weeks ago, a vague sense of dread about tomorrow's meeting. They all trigger the same primitive alarm system. During the day, distractions act like pressure valves, releasing that anxiety in small doses. But at night, no distractions, no release. Just you and your brain, locked in an exhausting wrestling match where every round makes the anxiety stronger. Here's where human behavior gets truly strange. The more someone tries to force themselves to relax, the worse the anxiety becomes. It's like telling someone, don't think about pink elephants. Suddenly that's all they can picture. Lying there at 3 a.m. desperately trying to fall asleep, checking the clock every 15 minutes, calculating how many hours of rest remain before the alarm goes off. This creates what psychologists call a performance anxiety loop. The person becomes anxious about being anxious, which generates more anxiety, which makes sleep even more impossible. The brain, now fully convinced something's wrong, doubles down on its hypervigilance. Strange and unusual psychological phenomena like this reveal how the mind can become its own worst enemy. Real-world example. Imagine someone lying awake worrying about a presentation the next day. During the day, they rehearsed their talking points while driving, mentally prepared while making dinner, visualized success while checking emails. But at night, with nothing else competing for attention, every possible mistake plays on repeat, forgetting lines, stumbling over words, facing judgment from colleagues. The presentation itself hasn't changed, the person's preparation hasn't diminished, but the absence of distractions transforms routine nervousness into full-blown panic. What makes this phenomenon particularly maddening is that the solutions most people try actually make things worse. Scrolling through social media at 4 a.m., that blue light tells the brain it's daytime, disrupting circadian rhythms even further. Lying perfectly still, eyes closed, trying to will sleep into existence? That just increases awareness of wakefulness. Getting frustrated and angry about not sleeping. Hello, cortisol spike, the stress hormone that guarantees another hour of wide-awake misery. The psychology behind sudden anxiety at night isn't about weakness or lack of willpower. It's about understanding how the brain functions when stripped of its normal operational framework. During daylight hours, external stimuli provide structure, meetings at 10 a.m., lunch at noon, deadlines at 5 p.m., but nighttime offers no structure, just an endless void of possibility where the mind fills empty space with whatever it finds most threatening. And here's the truly weird part that most people never consider. What surfaces during those anxious nights isn't random. The brain is trying to communicate something important, something that's been ignored or suppressed. That uncomfortable silence, it's actually creating space for truths the busy, distracted daytime mind has been too occupied to acknowledge. But understanding what those truths mean and why they emerge specifically when darkness falls and distractions disappear requires looking even deeper into how the primitive mind responds when it perceives itself vulnerable and exposed. Hypervigilance in the dark. The primitive mind takes control. When darkness settles and the bedroom becomes a cave of shadows, something ancient awakens inside the human brain. It's not imagination or childish fear. It's hypervigilance, a survival mechanism hardwired into human DNA from tens of thousands of years of evolution. The primitive mind, that older reptilian part of the brain responsible for fight or flight responses, doesn't understand that predators no longer lurk outside the door. It doesn't care about modern security systems, locked windows, or neighborhood watch programs. All it knows is this: darkness equals vulnerability, and vulnerability equals potential death. So it takes control, overriding rational thought with an overwhelming need to scan for threats. Every creak becomes a footstep, every shadow becomes a figure, every gust of wind against the window becomes something trying to get inside. This hypervigilant state floods the body with adrenaline, speeds up the heart rate, sharpens the senses, and prepares muscles for immediate action. The weird psychology of this response is that the conscious mind knows there's no real danger. But the primitive mind doesn't take suggestions, it takes command. Understanding human behavior during these episodes requires recognizing that two completely different operating systems are running simultaneously inside one skull. The neocortex, the thinking brain, tries to rationalize, "You're safe, you're in your home, nothing's wrong, go to sleep." But the amygdala, the alarm brain, screams louder, "Something feels off, stay alert, don't let your guard down." Survival depends on vigilance. Guess which one wins when someone's lying vulnerable in darkness? The amygdala doesn't debate or negotiate, it reacts. Real-world example, picture someone who lives alone in an apartment. During the day, they walk through their home without a second thought. But at 3 a.m., that same familiar hallway becomes threatening territory. They'll lie awake listening intently to every sound, the refrigerator humming, the building settling, neighbors moving around upstairs. Each noise gets catalogued, analyzed, and mentally mapped. Is that normal? Did I hear that before? Should I get up and check? The rational brain knows these are ordinary household sounds, but the primitive mind interprets ambiguity as danger. This strange and unusual psychological phenomenon explains why intelligent, capable adults can feel genuinely terrified in their own bedrooms despite zero objective threat. What makes hypervigilance particularly exhausting is that it creates a feedback loop that's nearly impossible to break without understanding how it works. The primitive mind detects a potential threat. Let's say a car door slams outside at 2 a.m. The body responds with a cortisol and adrenaline dump. Heart rate increases. Breathing becomes shallow. Muscles tense. Now the person is wide awake, alert, scanning for additional threats. But here's the cruel twist. Those physical sensations of anxiety themselves become interpreted as evidence that something's wrong. Why is my heart racing if there's no danger? Maybe there is danger and I just haven't identified it yet. So the brain searches harder, finding new things to worry about. Did I lock the front door? Is that smoke I smell? Was that sound closer than before? Each new worry triggers another anxiety response, which the primitive mind reads as confirmation of threat, which intensifies the vigilance even more. Psychology and human behavior in these moments reveals how the mind can trap itself in cycles where the alarm system becomes the emergency it's warning about. People experiencing this often describe feeling like they're on guard or standing watch, even though rationally they know nothing requires guarding. The truly fascinating and frustrating aspect of nighttime hypervigilance is how it distorts perception and memory. When the primitive mind takes control, it doesn't just change how someone feels, it changes what they literally see, hear, and remember. Studies on perception under stress show that hypervigilant individuals are significantly more likely to misinterpret neutral stimuli as threatening. A jacket hanging on a door becomes a person standing there. A tree branch scraping the window becomes someone trying to break in. The mind fills in gaps with worst-case scenarios because evolutionarily, assuming danger and being wrong was always safer than assuming safety and being wrong. This is why people who experience severe nighttime anxiety often report seeing things that weren't there when they check in daylight, not because they're losing touch with reality, but because their perception was being filtered through a threat detection lens that prioritizes survival over accuracy. Practical example, someone might lie awake convinced they heard footsteps in the hallway, absolutely certain someone's in the house. They eventually work up courage to investigate, turn on every light, check every room, find nothing. But instead of relief, they feel more anxious. Where did they go? Am I missing something? The primitive mind, once activated, resists being deactivated. It's looking for confirmation, not contradiction. And as this hypervigilant state persists night after night, it begins leaving permanent marks, not just in consciousness, but literally in the body's cellular memory, creating patterns that persist even when the mind finally tries to rest. The body remembers what the mind suppresses. Here's where things get genuinely unsettling. The body keeps score of everything the conscious mind tries to forget. Someone might think they've moved on from a traumatic event, processed their stress, dealt with their problems. They might go weeks, even months, feeling perfectly fine during waking hours, but then night comes, and suddenly the chest tightens, breathing becomes difficult, hands start trembling, and panic floods in from nowhere. There's no obvious trigger, no conscious memory surfacing, no nightmare playing out, just pure physical terror manifesting in the darkness. This strange and unusual psychological phenomenon is called somatic memory, and it reveals something profound about human behavior. The body doesn't lie, and it definitely doesn't forget. While the conscious mind can rationalize, minimize, and compartmentalize difficult experiences, the nervous system records everything with brutal honesty. Every suppressed fear, every swallowed emotion, every moment of helplessness that got pushed down during the day, the body catalogues it all. And nighttime, when conscious defenses drop and the mind relaxes its grip on control, becomes the moment when that suppressed material comes surging back. Not as thoughts or memories, but as raw physical sensations that feel like they're happening right now, in this moment, even though the actual event might have occurred years ago. The psychology behind this is both fascinating and terrifying. The human nervous system operates on two levels, conscious and unconscious. During the day, especially in survival mode, getting to work, managing responsibilities, interacting with people, the conscious mind stays in charge, keeping uncomfortable feelings at bay. I don't have time to deal with this right now becomes the mantra. I'll process it later. Except later never comes, because by the time someone has free time, they're exhausted and just want to zone out, with Netflix or scroll mindlessly through their phone. So the difficult emotions, the unprocessed stress, the accumulated tension, it all gets stored in the body. Muscles hold it, organs hold it, the nervous system holds it. Real-world example. Imagine someone who had a car accident 6 months ago. Physically, they recovered fine. Mentally, they tell themselves they're over it. But every night around the same time the accident occurred, their body floods with adrenaline. Their heart races, their breathing gets shallow, and they feel inexplicably terrified. They're not consciously thinking about the accident. In fact, they might not make the connection at all. But the body remembers the exact timestamp of trauma, and when that time approaches each night, it triggers a full physiological response. The mind might have suppressed the memory, but the body's replaying the emergency on an endless loop. What makes this particularly maddening is that people experiencing somatic anxiety often feel like they're going crazy because they can't identify a reason for their panic. Why am I feeling this way? Nothing bad is happening right now. What's wrong with me? They'll go to doctors who run tests and find nothing physically wrong. They'll try sleeping pills that don't work. They'll convince themselves they're having heart attacks or strokes, ending up in emergency rooms only to be told it's just anxiety. But here's what most medical professionals miss. It's not just anything. It's the body screaming about something the mind refuses to hear. Psychology and human behavior research shows that unprocessed emotional experiences don't simply disappear, they convert into physical symptoms. Chronic neck tension from carrying too much responsibility, digestive issues from swallowing anger repeatedly, chest tightness from suppressed grief. The body becomes a living archive of every feeling that never got expressed, every boundary that never got set, every truth that never got spoken. And nighttime anxiety, that's often the body's last-ditch attempt to get attention, forcing someone to finally acknowledge what they've been avoiding. Think of it like a pressure cooker. During the day, the lid stays on tight, keeping everything contained. But at night, when defenses relax, the pressure finds the weakest point and releases explosively. The truly weird psychology of somatic memory is that the body doesn't care about convenience, appropriate timing, or whether someone's ready to deal with their issues. It operates on its own timeline, following biological imperatives that predate language, culture, and conscious thought. Someone might have trained themselves to smile through pain, to stay positive, to never show weakness, but the body sees through every performance. It knows the difference between genuine safety and performing safety. It recognizes when someone's saying, "I'm fine," while internally drowning. And because the body's primary job is survival, not comfort, it will create increasingly intense symptoms until the person pays attention. This explains why nighttime anxiety often escalates over time if left unaddressed. What starts as mild restlessness becomes racing thoughts, which becomes panic attacks, which becomes chronic insomnia, which becomes physical illness. The body keeps turning up the volume on its distress signal until someone finally listens. Practical example. A person working in a toxic job environment might maintain perfect composure during business hours, never showing stress or fear. But every Sunday night, like clockwork, they experience crushing anxiety, nausea, and dread. Their mind says, "It's just work, everyone deals with this, I need the paycheck." But their body says, "This environment is dangerous, we need to escape, survival is threatened." The disconnect between what the mind insists is true and what the body knows is true creates that nighttime anxiety. The body's desperate attempt to communicate communicate what consciousness refuses to acknowledge. And until someone learns to listen to these somatic messages, to honor what the body's trying to say about unresolved experiences and suppressed emotions, that anxiety will continue manifesting in the darkness, night after night, growing stronger as the gap between mind and body widens into a chasm that sleep can no longer bridge. Sleep threshold. Dissociation. Anxiety between wakefulness and dreams. There exists a liminal space between being awake and falling asleep that most people pass through without noticing, but for those experiencing nighttime anxiety, this threshold becomes a psychological battleground. Sleep threshold dissociation is one of the strangest and most disorienting phenomena in human behavior, occurring in that fuzzy transition zone where consciousness begins dissolving but hasn't fully surrendered yet. In this in-between state, the logical mind starts shutting down while the emotional mind remains partially active, creating a nightmarish hybrid where fears feel amplified, thoughts become fragmented and irrational, and the person experiences a profound sense of losing control. It's like standing on the edge of a cliff, watching yourself fall but being unable to stop it. The weird psychology here is that the very act of trying to fall asleep, something that should be natural and automatic, becomes a source of intense anxiety. People describe feeling like they're slipping away or losing themselves, which triggers panic that jolts them back to full wakefulness. This creates yet another exhausting loop. The closer someone gets to sleep, the more anxious they become about crossing that threshold, which pushes sleep further away. What makes sleep threshold dissociation particularly disturbing is how it distorts reality in ways that feel genuinely frightening. As the brain transitions between conscious and unconscious states, it sometimes produces what neurologists call hypnagogic hallucinations, vivid sensory experiences that seem completely real. Someone might see shadows moving, hear voices or footsteps, feel pressure on their chest like someone sitting on them, or sense a presence in the room. These aren't dreams because the person is still partially awake and aware of their actual surroundings. They're not delusions because the person usually recognizes afterward that these experiences weren't real. They exist in a strange psychological gray zone where the dreaming mind starts generating content while the waking mind observes it, creating an experience that feels like reality is glitching. Real-world example. Imagine lying in bed, eyes closed, feeling yourself start to drift off. Suddenly, you hear your name called loudly, so clearly that you snap awake and sit up, heart pounding. But nobody's there. The house is silent. You're alone. That auditory hallucination occurred at the sleep threshold, generated by a brain caught between two states of consciousness. For someone already anxious about nighttime, experiences like this become proof that something's wrong, intensifying their fear of letting go into sleep. The psychology behind this phenomenon reveals how vulnerable humans are during the transition to sleep and why anxiety specifically targets this moment. Falling asleep requires surrendering conscious control, something the hypervigilant, anxious mind absolutely refuses to do. It's a trust issue at the neurological level. Sleep means becoming unconscious, defenseless, unaware of surroundings. For someone whose primitive brain is convinced that danger lurks nearby, surrendering to sleep feels like volunteering for death, so the mind fights it, creating reasons to stay awake. Did I lock the door? Is that sound normal? What if I stop breathing? What if I have a heart attack in my sleep? These intrusive thoughts intensify specifically at the sleep threshold because that's when the rational mind, which normally suppresses such fears, starts powering down. Strange and unusual psychological phenomena like this show how the same survival mechanisms that kept ancestors alive now torture modern humans who face no actual threats. The dissociation part, feeling disconnected from oneself during this transition, adds another layer of terror. People report feeling like they're watching themselves from outside their body, or that their mind and body are separating, or that they're dying. These dissociative experiences are the brain's stress response to the perceived danger of losing consciousness, but they feel so bizarre and frightening that they become their own source of trauma. What's truly fascinating about sleep threshold dissociation is how it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of sleeplessness. The more someone fears the transition to sleep, the more their brain interprets that threshold as dangerous, which makes the transition more difficult, which creates worse symptoms, which increases the fear. Over time, just lying down in bed becomes a trigger for for anxiety because the mind associates it with that terrifying liminal space where control dissolves. Psychology and human behavior research shows that people with chronic nighttime anxiety often develop elaborate rituals to avoid or delay reaching the sleep threshold, checking their phone repeatedly, getting up for water, adjusting pillows and blankets endlessly, listening to podcasts or videos. These aren't just bad sleep habits, they're avoidance behaviors designed to prevent encountering that dissociative state where the mind feels like it's losing its grip on reality. Practical example, someone might lie in bed for 3 hours, exhausted beyond measure, desperately wanting to sleep. But the moment they feel themselves starting to drift, off panic hits like an electric shock. They jolt awake, heart racing, breathing hard, completely terrified despite being in their safe bedroom. This can happen dozens of times a night, leaving them in a state of chronic sleep deprivation that makes anxiety even worse during the day. The body needs sleep to regulate stress hormones, process emotions, and restore the nervous system. But the anxious mind has turned sleep itself into the enemy. And here's the devastating truth most people never realize. The harder they try to force themselves through that threshold, the more resistant it becomes, because the effort itself signals danger to the primitive brain. Breaking free from this pattern doesn't come from willpower or simply relaxing. It requires understanding why the body remembers, why the primitive mind stays vigilant, and why consciousness itself becomes the battlefield where ancient survival instincts wage war against modern reality. So now you understand the 4 psychological mechanisms that transform peaceful nights into anxiety battlegrounds. But here's the critical question. What are you going to do with this knowledge? Are you going to keep pretending that nighttime anxiety is random, inexplicable, something you just have to endure? Or are you finally ready to acknowledge what your body's been screaming at you through those sleepless nights? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Knowing why this happens changes nothing unless you're willing to act on it. The brain without distractions revealed what you've been avoiding. Hypervigilance showed you what your primitive mind considers threatening. Somatic memory proved that your body's keeping score of every suppressed emotion. And sleep threshold dissociation exposed how terrified you are of losing control. These aren't abstract concepts. They're your reality, your nervous system's desperate communication strategy. So what unprocessed trauma are you carrying? What emotions have you been swallowing instead of expressing? What boundaries have you failed to set? What parts of your life make you feel fundamentally unsafe, even though you keep telling yourself everything's fine? Here's your challenge. Tonight, when that anxiety hits, instead of fighting it or fearing it, try asking it a question. What are you trying to tell me? Strange and unusual psychological phenomena like nighttime anxiety don't exist to torture you. They exist to wake you up to truths you've been avoiding. The body remembers what the mind suppresses, which means somewhere inside you already knows exactly what needs to change. Maybe it's that job that's slowly destroying your soul. Maybe it's that relationship where you perform happiness while dying inside. Maybe it's decades of conditioning that taught you to ignore your own needs, suppress your own voice, and prioritize everyone else's comfort over your own survival. Psychology and human behavior. Research proves that symptoms intensify until we address root causes. So how much worse does your nighttime anxiety need to get before you finally listen? How many more exhausting, terrifying nights will you endure before you honor what your nervous system's desperately trying to communicate? The weird psychology of all this is that the solution isn't comfortable. It's not a pill, a breathing technique, or a meditation app, though those might help manage symptoms. Real change requires confronting whatever you've been running from, feeling whatever you've been suppressing, and probably making some difficult decisions about how you're living. That's why most people never break free from chronic nighttime anxiety. They want the symptom gone without addressing what's causing it. They want to sleep peacefully while continuing to live in ways that make their nervous system scream danger. But you're not most people, are you? You didn't make it this far through this content because you want surface-level solutions. You're here because you're ready for truth, even when it's uncomfortable. You're here because you understand that genuine healing requires courage, honesty, and willingness to change. So here's what happens next. You take this knowledge and you actually apply it. You start paying attention to what surfaces during those anxious nights instead of trying to suppress it. You begin honoring your body's signals instead of overriding them. You make changes, maybe small ones at first, maybe massive ones eventually, that align your external life with your internal truth. And gradually, night by night, your nervous system starts recognizing that you're finally listening, that safety is being restored. That control doesn't mean suppression, but rather conscious choice. If you found value in this deep dive into the psychology behind sudden anxiety at night, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because we're going to keep exploring strange and unusual psychological psychological phenomena that most people never understand about their own minds and bodies. We're going to keep pulling back the curtain on human behavior that seems inexplicable until you know the mechanisms driving it. This is just the beginning. There's so much more to discover about the weird psychology of being human. So subscribe, stay curious, and most importantly, start listening to what your body's been trying to tell you all along.